July 7th, 1942, Akutan Island, Alaska. The sky over the rugged landscape was a dull grey, the wind whipping violently across the coastline. The air was thick with the salty scent of the Pacific, and far below the jagged rocks of Akutan's shore loomed like silent sentinels. High above, in the desperate climb of a dying fighter, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's Mitsubishi A6M Zero was fighting for its life. The Zero, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had already endured fierce combat, its engine now sputtering under the strain of battle damage. The sky was alive with tracer fire and the deep growl of aerial combat, but Koga's world was closing in. He had been involved in a brutal dogfight during the Battle of Midway, where the odds were stacked against him. His once unstoppable fighter, famed for its agility, was now limping badly wounded after sustaining hits during a skirmish with American F4F Wildcats. The tail section had taken a hit, and Koga could feel the aircraft's control becoming sluggish. The engine, already overheating from a damaged cooling system, faltered with every passing moment. Sweat beaded on Koga's forehead as he gripped the controls, trying desperately to keep the Zero aloft. But it was futile. The plane's once majestic roar had turned into a sickly rattle. He wasn't going to make it back to his carrier. His heart raced as he scanned the horizon. Below him, the vast expanse of Akutan Island appeared unexpectedly. The remote, desolate patch of land seemed like the only option for survival. With no choice but to attempt a crash landing, Koga took a deep breath and steeled himself for what was to come. His only thought was survival. The Zero's undercarriage touched the rugged, rocky beach of Akutan with a bone-jarring crash. The fuselage bounced and skidded across the uneven terrain, the plane scraping and tumbling as it came to an abrupt halt. Koga's head slammed into the cockpit, the impact rattling his senses. For a moment he lost consciousness. When he came to, the smell of gasoline and the faint scent of smoke filled the cockpit. His vision was blurry, his body aching from the violent crash. The Zero, though battered and damaged, had remained mostly intact. Koga was disoriented but alive. The aircraft lay still half buried in the sand, its wings bent, the propeller destroyed, but its fuselage surprisingly intact. The world around him was eerily quiet, save for the wind howling through the rocks. He struggled to unbuckle his harness, his limbs stiff from the crash. His mind raced as he looked around, realizing he was stranded on an isolated island in the farthest reaches of the Alaskan wilderness, with no immediate way of escape. Koga had always known that the Zero, while an incredible weapon in the hands of a skilled pilot, was fragile. Its speed and maneuverability came at a high price. It lacked the armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that were becoming standard in American aircraft. Yet in this moment, the stark truth of the aircraft's vulnerability was apparent. The plane was ruined, but more than that, Koga realized that he too was stranded alone with little hope of survival if rescue didn't come soon. Koga climbed out of the cockpit, the pain in his limbs a sharp reminder of his luck and misfortune. His thoughts flashed to his fellow pilots, to the battle that had left him alone on this desolate island. As he staggered away from the wreckage, the severity of the situation hit him. He had crashed in enemy territory. His survival depended on the very forces he had been fighting just moments before. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway was reaching its critical point. The Americans, though heavily outnumbered, had begun to turn the tide of the battle thanks in large part to their superior intelligence. The Japanese, despite their numerical advantage, were not prepared for the American assault. They had underestimated the power of American naval forces and were now paying the price. Yet Koga's crash would become a small but pivotal event that would eventually reveal a flaw in the heart of the Japanese war machine. It wasn't long before the first rescue party was dispatched. A small group of U.S. Marines operating in the region as part of the ongoing efforts to secure the Pacific had heard reports of a downed aircraft. They made their way to the island unsure of what they would find. As they approached, the Marines could see the outline of the wrecked Zero, half buried in the sand, its wings mangled but still strangely recognizable. They cautiously approached the wreckage, weapons drawn. It wasn't until they got closer that the true significance of the discovery began to dawn on them. The Zero, though badly damaged, was in surprisingly good condition. The engine was still partially intact, the cockpit was mostly undisturbed, and the plane's once sleek fuselage bore the unmistakable markings of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At first, the Marines were unsure of what they had stumbled upon. They knew it was an enemy aircraft, but the condition of the plane was extraordinary. It seemed almost too perfect for something that had just crash-landed. It wasn't long before the Marines realized the true significance of the find. This was no ordinary Zero. This was an opportunity to learn firsthand about one of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, a weapon that had wreaked havoc on American forces for over a year. The U.S. military's recovery teams moved quickly to secure the wreckage. The Zero was carefully disassembled and transported back to a naval base for analysis. For the Americans, this was an unprecedented chance to study a Japanese aircraft up close and gain valuable intelligence that could be used to turn the tide of the Pacific War. Back in the U.S., military engineers and pilots immediately began to examine the Zero's design. The initial assessment revealed some surprising truths about the aircraft. While the Zero was fast, nimble, and capable of outmaneuvering most American planes, it lacked one critical feature: armor protection for the pilot. The lack of armor meant that the pilot was incredibly vulnerable in combat, a design flaw that would soon be exploited by American forces. The engineers at the naval base began their work carefully studying the Zero's construction, from its lightweight frame to the innovative materials used in its build. The Zero was made with a special aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, a material that made the aircraft lighter and more agile than its American counterparts. But the lack of armor, plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that the Zero was far more susceptible to damage than initially thought. For weeks, the U.S. Navy tested the aircraft, pushing it to its limits to understand its weaknesses. The findings were staggering. The Japanese had sacrificed pilot protection for speed and maneuverability, and this flaw would cost them dearly in the coming battles. The crash landing on Akutan Island, though seemingly a small event in the grand scope of the war, would prove to be a critical moment in the Pacific conflict. The intelligence gathered from the wrecked Zero would provide American pilots with the knowledge they needed to counter the Japanese threat. It would lead to the development of new tactics and strategies that would turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. As the Marines carefully dismantled the remains of the aircraft and prepared it for transport back to the mainland, no one could have known how significant this discovery would become. In the isolated wilderness of Akutan Island, a single crash had led to the capture of one of the most significant pieces of intelligence in the entire war. The Zero, once a symbol of Japanese air superiority, was now a key to unlocking the secrets of the enemy and ultimately defeating them in the skies over the Pacific. The crash on Akutan Island was more than just the wreckage of a fallen aircraft. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific War, one in which the United States would finally understand the flaws of the enemy it had been fighting for over a year. And in the years to come, the lessons learned from Koga's crash would become a cornerstone in the development of American tactics, technology, and strategy, helping to secure the victory that would end the war. July 10, 1942. Akutan Island, Alaska. As the crash site was secured, the Marines began the process of examining the wreckage. The harsh wind howled across the island, but there was an unnatural stillness around the downed Zero. The wreckage, though damaged, bore a strange sense of quiet dignity, almost as if it were waiting to be discovered. The aircraft had clearly been through a brutal ordeal, yet its integrity remained strikingly intact. For the Marines, the mission was clear: recover whatever was salvageable. They knew the importance of gathering enemy aircraft remains, but even they couldn't fully grasp the significance of what they were about to find. The Zero, a machine feared for its deadly effectiveness in combat, had now become a piece of critical intelligence for the Americans. As the Marines began to dismantle the aircraft, the absence of armor protection immediately stood out. There were no thick plates of steel around the cockpit, no reinforced materials protecting the pilot. The Zero, despite its formidable speed and maneuverability, was shockingly vulnerable in the most crucial aspect: pilot protection. The U.S. engineers and intelligence officers were stunned. How could the Japanese have overlooked such a fundamental design flaw? The Zero had no self-sealing fuel tanks either, leaving it exposed to fire damage in ways American fighters were built to withstand. The Marines noted the sleekness of the Zero's design, the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction, but it was clear now that the aircraft's design was a double-edged sword. It was lightweight and fast, but those very qualities made it fragile. Speed and agility were prioritized over the protection of the pilot, and this would become the key to its downfall. Back at base, the aircraft was carefully disassembled and transported. The engineers began their painstaking examination of the Zero, focused on understanding every detail of the aircraft's construction. The discovery was becoming more significant with each passing hour. As the American engineers turned their attention to the Zero's materials, they marveled at the use of extra super duralumin, a lightweight aluminum alloy used in the construction of the plane's frame. The material designed to reduce weight while maintaining strength had made the Zero one of the most agile fighters in the Pacific theater. Yet this material, while innovative, was not enough to make up for the glaring lack of defensive features. The aircraft's lack of armor meant that in the event of a hit, the Zero's fragile frame would buckle easily. The Zero's performance in the air had been a source of admiration and fear for American pilots. Its speed and agility were unparalleled, and it had become infamous for cutting through American squadrons like a hot knife through butter. But now, with this downed aircraft in hand, the Americans were beginning to understand that the Zero's agility came at a steep price, the vulnerability of its pilot. It was not just the lack of armor that became apparent during the inspection of the Zero. The design of the aircraft also made it susceptible to failure under certain conditions. The American engineers quickly discovered that the Zero's engine would stall if subjected to negative G-forces, something American pilots were well trained to exploit. In high-speed dives or evasive maneuvers, the Zero would struggle to maintain control, further revealing its weaknesses. The engineers also uncovered that the Zero's ailerons, vital for controlling the aircraft's roll, froze at speeds exceeding 200 knots. This meant that during high-speed combat, the Zero's pilot would have limited control over the aircraft, especially in tight turns or evasive actions. The implications of these findings were immediate. The U.S. now had an upper hand in understanding how to neutralize the once-feared fighter. This analysis would prove crucial. Armed with the knowledge of the Zero's vulnerabilities, American pilots began to devise new strategies. The tactics that would later become known as boom and zoom relied on the Zero's weaknesses. Instead of engaging the enemy in close dogfights, American pilots would dive from above with overwhelming speed and firepower, then climb away before the Zero could counterattack. The lack of armor and the engine's susceptibility to damage under negative G-forces meant that even a few hits could cripple the Japanese aircraft. The Zero's discovery on Akutan Island was more than just a moment of tactical advantage. It was a turning point in the Pacific War, an intelligence breakthrough that allowed the United States to adapt its tactics in a way that was impossible before. The recovery of the Zero laid bare the flaws of Japanese engineering flaws that would prove critical in the battles to come. In the following weeks, engineers worked tirelessly to reverse engineer every detail of the aircraft, piecing together what made it effective and what made it vulnerable. The intelligence gathered from the Zero didn't just influence tactics, it had a direct impact on the development of the American fighter fleet. The knowledge of the Zero's flaws would shape the design of the F6F Hellcat, one of the most successful American aircraft of the war. The Hellcat was built with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, with a focus on survivability, a direct countermeasure to the Zero's design philosophy. The impact of the Akutan Zero was not just tactical but symbolic as well. For the United States, it represented the ability to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The discovery of the Zero was a reminder that even the most feared weapons could be undermined with the right intelligence. The Japanese had sacrificed the protection of their pilots for speed and maneuverability, and in doing so, they had created a critical vulnerability that would be exploited in the months to come. Koga, the pilot of the Zero, had not survived the crash, and his death marked the tragic end of a promising career. But his sacrifice, along with the discovery of the Zero, would go on to shape the future of the war. The aircraft's design, once seen as an unbeatable force, was now a template for how the Americans could defeat Japan's air power. The intelligence gained from Koga's crash would ultimately help turn the tide of the Pacific War as American forces adapted, innovated, and learned from their enemy. The moment Koga's Zero touched down on the sands of Akutan Island, it seemed like just another piece of the larger conflict. But as the wreckage was analyzed, it became clear that the crash had exposed a vulnerability in one of Japan's most powerful weapons. And in the weeks and months that followed, this intelligence would begin to reshape the very nature of the war, propelling the United States to victory in the Pacific. July 15, 1942. Naval Air Station, North Island, California. The Zero had made its way from the isolated Alaskan island to the naval base under tight security. It was carefully examined and documented by a team of engineers and test pilots eager to unlock its secrets. The aircraft's immediate significance was clear. It was the most advanced fighter the Japanese had to offer, and it had been a terror in the skies for over a year. But as the engineers began their work, it became evident that the plane's exceptional reputation had been built on a foundation of critical design flaws. The first thing that struck the engineers was the lack of armor. In contrast to American fighters, which were heavily reinforced to withstand hits, the Zero was almost entirely unprotected. Its thin-skinned design was intended to reduce weight, but this came at the cost of pilot safety. There were no armored plates around the cockpit, no reinforced fuel tanks to prevent explosions in the event of a hit. The Zero was a beautifully crafted machine, but one that in the end could not protect its most valuable asset, the pilot. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, an experienced test pilot, was among the first to take the Zero into the air. Sanders had flown many enemy aircraft before, but the Zero presented a unique challenge. It was light, fast and agile, a perfect predator in the right hands. But as Sanders pushed the Zero to its limits, the true weaknesses of the aircraft began to surface. The first issue Sanders encountered was the Zero's engine. Under normal conditions, the aircraft performed flawlessly, climbing quickly and making sharp turns with ease. But during high-speed dives, Sanders noticed that the engine sputtered and the plane would lose power under negative G-forces. This was a critical vulnerability in combat. A pilot might need to perform evasive maneuvers that would put the aircraft into negative G-forces, such as pulling out of a dive or evading enemy fire. The Zero's engine simply could not handle that kind of stress. The next flaw came when Sanders tested the aircraft's high-speed capabilities. The Zero, like many high-performance fighters, was designed to reach impressive speeds. But at speeds exceeding 200 knots, the aircraft's ailerons, essential for controlling the roll of the aircraft, froze severely, limiting the Zero's maneuverability at crucial moments. In combat, this could be disastrous. A Zero pilot unable to roll the plane in a dogfight would be at the mercy of a more agile opponent. This was a significant weakness that the Japanese had overlooked in their pursuit of speed. The most shocking discovery, however, was the complete lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. In the heat of battle, when enemy fire could tear through the aircraft, American planes were designed to withstand hits by sealing their fuel tanks. But the Zero lacked this crucial feature. A single bullet could easily ignite the plane's fuel and cause catastrophic damage. It was a design flaw that placed every pilot in the Zero at extreme risk. As Sanders continued to push the limits of the aircraft, he realized that the Zero was a machine that had been built to excel in certain areas, but failed miserably in others. Its unparalleled agility and speed made it a deadly opponent, but its lack of durability and vulnerability to basic combat damage exposed its fatal flaws. The engineers at the base quickly realized the implications of their findings. They had just uncovered the weaknesses of one of the most feared aircraft in the world. This intelligence would prove invaluable in the coming months, as it would provide American pilots with the knowledge they needed to defeat the Zero in combat. The design flaws were now well known, and the next step was to develop tactics that would exploit these weaknesses. With this newfound knowledge, American pilots began to adapt to the Zero's weaknesses. The solution came in the form of the boom and zoom tactic, a strategy designed to use the American fighters' superior firepower and speed to their advantage. Instead of engaging the Zero in the close, tight dogfights where it excelled, American pilots would use their superior altitude to dive on the enemy with devastating force. The strategy was simple yet effective. An American fighter would approach from above, dive down on a Japanese Zero with overwhelming speed and firepower, and then climb away before the enemy could react. The Zero, with its fragile frame and lack of armor, could not withstand the impact of the American aircraft's heavy weapons. A single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could cripple the Zero, and the boom and zoom tactic made it nearly impossible for the Zero to retaliate effectively. The key to success with this tactic was timing and precision. The American pilots had to dive at the right moment, strike with maximum force, and then climb away quickly before the Zero could react. With the knowledge of the Zero's design flaws, American pilots now had the upper hand in aerial combat. The agility of the Zero was no longer an advantage. It had become a liability. As the Americans began to use the boom and zoom tactic more effectively, the results were staggering. The Zero, once the dominant force in the Pacific, began to fall out of favor. American pilots had the knowledge, the tactics, and the firepower to neutralize the Zero's advantages. And with every victory, the Japanese realized that their aircraft, despite its impressive reputation, could be defeated. The findings from the Akutan Zero didn't just impact tactics. They also had a direct influence on the design of American aircraft. In the wake of the Zero's capture, engineers began to incorporate the lessons learned from the Japanese fighter into the development of new U.S. aircraft. The F6F Hellcat, which would go on to become the most successful carrier-based fighter of World War II, was a direct result of the information gained from the Akutan Zero. The Hellcat was built with an emphasis on durability and survivability, incorporating features like armor, plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks that were missing from the Zero. These design improvements made the Hellcat a far more resilient aircraft capable of surviving the damage that would have brought down a Zero. The Hellcat's robust construction, combined with the knowledge of the Zero's weaknesses, made it a formidable opponent for the Japanese. By the end of the Pacific War, the F6F Hellcat had achieved an incredible kill-to-loss ratio of 191, making it one of the most successful fighters in history. The intelligence gathered from the Akutan Zero played a key role in this success, helping to ensure that American pilots could exploit the flaws in Japanese aircraft and emerge victorious in the skies. The legacy of the Akutan Zero is not just one of intelligence and tactical advantage. It represents the power of adaptation and innovation in warfare. The United States, faced with a formidable enemy and a powerful adversary in the skies, was able to learn from its mistakes and turn the tide of the war. The Akutan Zero, a single captured aircraft, became a symbol of how intelligence, when used effectively, can change the course of a conflict. As the American forces gained momentum in the Pacific, the Japanese were forced to confront the reality that their air superiority was no longer guaranteed. The American pilots, armed with knowledge of the Zero's vulnerabilities, had developed tactics and aircraft that could defeat it, and in doing so, they secured a crucial advantage that would help lead to victory in the Pacific. By late 1942, American naval forces had already begun to capitalize on the intelligence gained from the Akutan Zero. The lessons learned from its design flaws were directly translated into American tactics, but even more importantly, into the engineering of their own aircraft. The F6F Hellcat, a carrier-based fighter, emerged as one of the most successful products of this knowledge. Unlike the Zero, the Hellcat was built with one key priority in mind: survivability. American engineers ensured that the Hellcat was heavily armored with a reinforced fuselage and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that had been conspicuously absent in the Japanese aircraft. These design changes made the Hellcat far more resilient to enemy fire, allowing it to take hits and still return to base, a stark contrast to the fragile nature of the Zero. The Hellcat's robustness was only part of the equation. The knowledge of the Zero's aerodynamic weaknesses gave American pilots a distinct edge. Armed with the boom and zoom tactics, pilots could now engage the Zero with a new level of confidence. The Hellcat's firepower, including its powerful .50 caliber machine guns, made short work of the lightly armored Zero, exploiting the vulnerabilities the Japanese had overlooked in their pursuit of speed and agility. By the end of the Pacific War, the Hellcat had become a symbol of American air superiority. The aircraft's kill-to-loss ratio was an astonishing 1.91, a testament to its effectiveness in combat. With over 5,000 Hellcats produced, they played a crucial role in securing victory for the Allies in the Pacific theater. The lessons learned from the Akutan Zero were integral to the Hellcat's success, and the aircraft's achievements in combat proved the value of studying and understanding enemy weaknesses. The Akutan Zero, which had once been a source of dread for American pilots, was now a key to unlocking the secrets of Japan's air power. Its capture had exposed a critical flaw in the design of Japan's most feared fighter, and that knowledge would forever change the outcome of aerial combat in the Pacific. It was not just a single victory for American intelligence, it was the beginning of a new era in the Pacific War.